Most civilizations die once. One invasion, one collapse, one silence that stretches into centuries until the language is forgotten, the temples are buried, and the people who once built wonders become footnotes in someone else's history. That is the normal pattern of history, and almost every great civilization has followed it. Babylon fell. Assyria vanished. Ancient Egypt was absorbed so completely that its descendants today speak Arabic, not the tongue of the pharaohs. But one civilization broke this rule so many times that historians stopped calling it coincidence and started asking a different question entirely. How? How does a civilization survive Alexander the Great, the Arab Caliphate, the Mongol hordes and Tamerlane, and still exist today? How does a nation absorb conqueror after conqueror until the conquerors themselves begin speaking your language, building your architecture, and bowing before your gods? This is the story of Persia, a civilization that did not survive history by being the strongest. It survived by being the most deeply, stubbornly, irreversibly itself. And understanding how it did that will change the way you see every empire that ever rose and every empire that ever fell. Before there was Persia, there was the land. And the land, from the very beginning, was not gentle. The Iranian plateau rises from the earth like a fortress that nature built for a reason. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form a wall of rock and ice. To the north, the Alborz Range sweeps in a long, cold arc. At the center, vast salt deserts stretch across the interior, cracked, pale, and merciless under the summer sun. This is not a land that invites visitors. It is a land that tests them. And yet, along the river valleys and mountain foothills where water found its way, life took hold with extraordinary determination. Settlements appeared here thousands of years before the Common Era. By around 3000 BCE, a sophisticated civilization called Elam had already built cities, temples, and trade networks in the southwestern lowlands near the Zagros foothills. The Elamites were not peripheral. They were contemporaries and rivals of Sumer and Babylon, one of the earliest urban civilizations on Earth, flourishing in the shadow of mountains while the rest of the ancient world was still learning what a city could be. Then, around 1500 BCE, the plateau began to change. From the steppes of Central Asia, waves of nomadic peoples moved southward. They called themselves Aryans, a word meaning noble in their own tongue. They brought horses, fire worship, and a way of seeing the world that would eventually become the oldest living religion on Earth. Two groups settled and consolidated: the Medes in the northwest, the Persians in the south, in a region they called Parsa. For centuries, both groups lived in the shadow of greater powers, paying tribute to the thundering empires of Assyria and Babylon. The mountains, however, had their own plans. The first great empire to emerge from the Iranian plateau was not Persian, it was Median. Around 700 BCE, a chieftain named Deioces understood something that would define Iranian political genius for the next 2,000 years. Survival requires unity, and unity requires a center. He built that center in the highlands, a capital called Ecbatana, described in ancient sources as a city of concentric walls, each ring painted a different color, the innermost gleaming with silver and gold. Whether the legend matched the reality matters less than what Ecbatana represented. A fixed point, a capital around which scattered tribes could organize themselves as something greater than a collection of clans. His grandson, Cyaxares, completed the transformation. He reorganized the Median army by weapon type: spearmen, cavalry, archers, creating the most disciplined fighting force the plateau had yet produced. Then he looked west at the Assyrian Empire. The most feared military machine the ancient world had yet seen was cracking under its own weight. Cyaxares recognized what few rulers ever do. Even the mightiest empires die when they exhaust themselves. He allied with Babylon. In 612 BCE, their combined armies descended on Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, the city the prophet Nahum had called the City of Blood. After a siege that lasted months, the walls fell. Nineveh was burned to its foundations. The empire that had terrorized the ancient Near East for centuries simply ceased to exist in a single afternoon. The ancient world had never seen anything like it. And watching from the south, in the Persian heartland of Parsa, a young prince was paying very close attention. His name was Cyrus. Born of the Achaemenid clan, raised partly in the Median court, Cyrus had watched power from the inside. He had seen what an empire looked like when it worked, and what it looked like when it began to rot. Around 559 BCE, he became king of Anshan, a Persian subkingdom within the Median sphere. For a time, he paid his tribute. He kept his head down. He waited. Then he stopped waiting. The revolt began around 550 BCE, and what followed was less a war than a collapse. Median commanders, deeply resentful of King Astyages, defected to Cyrus mid-campaign. The Median army dissolved where it stood. Astyages was captured. The great capital of Ecbatana simply changed hands. The Median Empire did not fall in fire. It fell in silence from within. But what Cyrus did next revealed why history would remember him for 3,000 years. He did not destroy, he absorbed. Median nobles kept their positions. Median court customs continued. The machinery of empire, the administration, the roads, the tax systems kept running under new management. Cyrus understood something most conquerors never grasped. The machinery of power is more valuable than the satisfaction of tearing it apart. He turned west next, toward Lydia and its king Croesus, the wealthiest man alive. The story goes that Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi before marching east. The oracle told him that if he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would be destroyed. He crossed the river. He destroyed a great empire, his own. In 539 BCE, Cyrus turned toward the greatest city on earth, Babylon. A metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls, ringed by walls so massive that Herodotus claimed 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other on top of them. The city seemed impregnable. It surrendered without a fight. Babylonian priests and merchants, disenchanted with their own king, opened the gates. Cyrus entered not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, grasping the hands of Marduk's statue in the ancient ritual of legitimate kingship. The city did not mourn, it celebrated. Then came the act that echoes loudest across history. Cyrus issued a decree, recorded on a small clay cylinder now known as the Cyrus cylinder, recognizing the religious traditions of all peoples within his empire. Deportees were permitted to return to their homelands. The Assyrian and Babylonian practice of mass forced resettlement was explicitly repudiated. The Hebrew Bible records Cyrus's name with a reverence reserved for almost no foreign ruler. The prophet Isaiah calls him a shepherd, a Messiah. Shams debate how much of this tolerance was genuine philosophy and how much was brilliant political calculation. Perhaps it was both. An empire stretching from the Aegean coast to Central Asia could not be ruled through terror alone. It required legitimacy in the eyes of dozens of peoples, languages, and gods. Cyrus gave them that legitimacy, and they gave him in return something no army could provide: compliance. And something rarer: trust. He died around 530 BCE on campaign along the eastern frontier. His body was brought back to Pasargadae, where a simple stone tomb still stands today. One ancient traveler reported an inscription carved above the entrance: "I am Cyrus, King of Kings. Do not begrudge me this small monument." Cyrus left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen. He also left behind the question every empire must eventually answer: who comes next? His son, Cambyses, added Egypt. His mysterious death in 522 BCE triggered a succession crisis that nearly unraveled everything. Into that vacuum stepped a man named Darius, a Persian nobleman of royal blood, who, along with 6 conspirators, moved swiftly against a usurper on the throne. It was, by any honest account, a coup. Darius understood immediately that legitimacy was his most urgent problem. How do you convince an empire of millions that your seizure of power was righteous? You carve it into a mountain. 600 feet above the main road between Babylon and Ecbatana, Darius had craftsmen chisel his version of events across a sheer cliff face in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. He is depicted in relief, triumphant, his foot resting on a fallen usurper while defeated rebel leaders stand bound before him. The gods, the text insists, gave him this victory. The lie, if it was one, was literally carved into the mountain. That same inscription, the Behistun inscription, would become, 2,000 years later, the key that unlocked the entire cuneiform writing system. When a British officer painstakingly copied the text in the 1830s, its trilingual nature allowed scholars to finally decode ancient Mesopotamian languages. Darius's propaganda accidentally became archaeology's greatest gift. Once the throne was secured, Darius turned his energy towards something no Persian ruler had yet attempted: systematically organizing the machinery of an empire. He divided the realm into roughly 20 administrative units called satrapies, each governed by a trusted official who collected taxes, maintained order, and answered directly to the king. Crucially, military commanders and financial inspectors in each region reported independently to the crown, overlapping chains of accountability that checked any single governor's power. Darius understood bureaucracy the way Cyrus had understood conquest. Binding these provinces together was the Royal Road, a highway stretching nearly 1,700 miles from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland. Royal couriers riding in relays could cover this distance in roughly 7 days, a speed of communication the ancient world found almost miraculous. Herodotus marveled at those couriers. He wrote that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stopped them. Those words would one day be inscribed on the main post office in New York City. To unify commerce across this vast territory, Darius introduced the darak, a gold coin bearing the king's image, along with standardized weights and measures. For the first time, a merchant in Anatolia and a merchant in Central Asia could conduct business in a shared language of value. And then there was Persepolis. Beginning around 518 BCE, Darius initiated construction of a ceremonial capital on a great elevated platform in the Persian homeland. tens of thousands of workers, paid wages that administrative tablets still record, raised towering columned halls, decorated with carved delegations from every corner of the empire. Not a fortress, not a monument to fear, an image of unity rendered in stone.
The empire Darius built was the most sophisticated administrative structure the world had yet seen. But along its western edge lay a problem it could not administer away. The Greek city-states of Ionia, absorbed into Persian control for decades, erupted in revolt in 499 BCE. When Athens sent ships to support the rebels, and those rebels burned the regional capital of Sardis, Darius received the news with cold fury. An attendant was instructed to remind the king of Athens 3 times each day so that he would never forget who had humiliated him. His first expedition against Greece faltered when a storm wrecked the Persian fleet off Mount Athos. His second expedition landed at Marathon in 490 BCE. A Greek force, smaller but fighting on ground of its own choosing, attacked the Persian line at a run. The result stunned the ancient world. Persia lost thousands, Athens lost fewer than 200. Darius died before he could launch his revenge. That task fell to his son Xerxes, who assembled the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever attempted, perhaps 200,000 soldiers, and bridged the Hellespont itself to walk them into Europe.
The answer, when it came, rode in from Macedonia. In 334 BCE, a young general crossed the Hellespont with roughly 40,000 soldiers and began dismantling the largest empire on earth. Alexander was 22 years old. The Persian resistance collapsed with startling speed. 2 early victories opened the western provinces. Then, at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander met the Persian king Darius III in person and routed him so completely that Darius fled the field, leaving behind his own mother, wife, and daughters as captives. Alexander treated them with conspicuous respect. The decisive blow came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, leveling terrain to maximize his war chariots. It was not enough. Alexander's oblique cavalry charge tore open the Persian line. Darius fled for the second time. The Achaemenid Empire, that extraordinary structure built by Cyrus and Darius the Great across 2 centuries, ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Persepolis was taken, its treasury plundered. Then, in 330 BCE, its palaces were burned. Ancient sources disagree on whether the fire was deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens or an accident during a drunken banquet. The truth is probably irretrievable. What is certain is that the magnificent stone terraces, the painted columns, the accumulated wealth of generations, all were consumed. Travelers would find the ruins blackened for centuries afterward. Yet even as he destroyed, Alexander was transforming himself. He adopted Persian court dress. He incorporated Iranian nobles into his administration. He married a Persian princess. He was not merely conquering Iran, he was becoming it.
Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32. Fever, most historians believe. Though an empire held together by one man's will rarely survives the moment that will disappears. His generals spent 40 years tearing his conquests apart. Iran eventually fell to Seleucus, who founded a dynasty bearing his name. Greek cities rose across the plateau. Greek became the language of administration. Hellenistic culture pressed deep into ancient soil. But beneath the marble columns and the Greek inscriptions, something older persisted. Persian dialects continued in villages and valleys. Zoroastrian fire temples kept burning, tended by priests whose liturgical knowledge stretched back through generations the Greeks had never touched. Local administrators quietly carried forward the Achaemenid inheritance, running the same systems, collecting the same taxes, speaking the same language at home. Conquerors could rename the cities, they could not rename the people. From the northeastern reaches of the former empire, a nomadic Iranian people called the Parni were watching. Their moment came around 247 BCE, when a chieftain named Arsaces led his warriors into the region of Parthia and seized it from its Seleucid governor. The act seemed almost reckless. Arsaces had no palace, no treasury, no administrative apparatus. What he had was momentum and the instinct to move when empires are distracted. He moved at exactly the right time. His successors would treat the name Arsaces with such reverence that every subsequent Parthian king adopted it as a royal title, blurring individual identity into something approaching myth. The Parthian Empire had begun, and Persia, which had seemed to vanish, had simply changed its face. For nearly 5 centuries, the Parthians held a frontier that Rome, the most powerful military force the Western world had ever produced, could never break. In 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions, the wealthiest man in Rome, a third of the ruling triumvirate alongside Caesar and Pompey. He came from military glory. He found something else entirely. The Parthian commander met him in the Syrian desert, not with a massed charge, but with swirling, shifting waves of cavalry. Roman infantry locked shields and waited for the momentum to exhaust itself, as it always had against every other enemy. The arrows did not stop. A camel train carrying thousands of spare arrows moved behind the Parthian lines, and when Roman soldiers broke formation to pursue, the famous Parthian shot found them, arrows released backward at full gallop with lethal accuracy. Crassus died in the aftermath. Some 20,000 Roman soldiers died with him. Another 10,000 marched into captivity and were never seen again. The captured Roman military standards, the eagle banners that embodied Roman military honor, were placed in Parthian temples. They stood there for decades, monuments to Roman defeat, until Augustus finally recovered them through diplomacy. An event he celebrated with such theatrical enthusiasm that one might forget no battle had actually been fought. Mark Antony tried where Crassus had failed and retreated, having lost a quarter of his army. Emperor Trajan came closest to decisive victory, sacking the Parthian capital in 116 CE and briefly reaching the Persian Gulf. His successor, Hadrian, abandoned most of the conquest within years. 2 empires, centuries of war. The frontier barely moved.
The breaking point came not from Rome, but from within Iran itself. In the spring of 224 CE, a man named Ardashir, son of Papak, grandson of a Zoroastrian priest named Sasan, met the last Parthian king in battle near the river Hormozd. The Parthian king died on the field. With him died 5 centuries of Arsacid rule, and a new name entered history, the Sasanians. What Ardashir built was something deliberately, consciously different from the Parthian world that preceded him. Where the Parthians had governed through feudal decentralization, the Sasanians restored the idea of a single divine Persian king. The title they chose was telling, Shah-hun-Shah, King of Kings, but now infused with sacred meaning. The king was not merely a ruler, he was the earthly representative of divine order itself. Zoroastrianism, which had persisted through centuries without official patronage, was now elevated into something altogether more formidable. A priestly class called the Magi organized into a proper hierarchy. Sacred fires burned in temples maintained by state authority. Orthodoxy was defined. texts were compiled. For the first time in its history, Zoroastrianism had both institutional structure and royal backing. Then Ardashir's son Shapur inherited the throne and turned his ambitions towards Rome, with results that would be commemorated in stone for centuries. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, the Roman Emperor Valerian made the catastrophic decision to engage Shapur directly. The battle became a rout. Then something happened that had no parallel in ancient history. A reigning Roman emperor was captured alive on the battlefield.
Shapur commemorated his triumph at Nakhche Rostam, the ancient cliff face near Persepolis where Achaemenid kings lay buried. His stonemasons carved an enormous relief into the rock. There stands Shapur on horseback, massive and triumphant. At his feet kneels a Roman emperor. Behind him, another stands in submission, grasping the royal bridle. The image broadcast across centuries what words alone could not sustain. Persia had humbled the greatest power in the Western world. Under the Sasanians, Persian civilization reached perhaps its greatest intellectual height. The Academy of Gondishapur in southwestern Iran became, under royal patronage, the most important center of learning in the ancient world. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 CE, many displaced scholars traveled east. Gondishapur welcomed them. Greek physicians, Indian mathematicians, Syriac translators, and Persian astronomers worked under a single roof, creating a synthesis of knowledge without parallel in the ancient world. Medical techniques developed there would not reach Western Europe for centuries. The institution became the model for the great translation movements that would follow under the early Islamic caliphates. Persian craftsmen of this period produced textiles of breathtaking complexity. Woven silks depicting hunting scenes traded from China to Constantinople. Silver metalwork setting aesthetic standards imitated across the known world. Two enduring gifts to global culture emerged from Sasanian courts: the game of chess, transformed from its Indian origins into the strategic game recognizable today, and polo, already a Persian passion, played with a ferocity that blurred the line between sport and military training. Booth traveled westward along trade routes, carrying Persian cultural prestige with them.
But no golden age exists without shadow. The Sasanians fought Byzantium for 4 centuries, contesting control of Mesopotamia, Syria, and the rich trade corridors of the Near East. Campaigns that exhausted both empires across generations. By the early 6th century, under Khosrow II, Sasanian armies achieved conquests that seemed to vindicate every claim of Persian greatness. Jerusalem fell. Egypt was taken. Byzantine armies were pushed back toward Constantinople itself. For one extraordinary decade, it appeared that Persia had finally, decisively, won the ancient contest. It had not. The overreach was catastrophic. The Byzantine counterattack left both empires shattered and gasping. In the 4 years following the death of Khosrow II, no fewer than 8 rulers claimed the Persian throne in rapid succession. Generals removed kings, factions poisoned pretenders. The treasury was empty, the army was fragmented. Neither side recognized the true danger approaching from the south. From a desert peninsula that neither Rome nor Persia had ever considered worth serious attention, the faith of Islam was binding together the Arab tribes with something more powerful than any king's command, a unity of absolute conviction that no military reorganization alone could create. The decisive confrontation came in 636 CE
at a place on the Euphrates called Al-Qadisiyah. For 3 days, perhaps 4, Sasanian forces held against the Arab advance. On the final day, a sandstorm blew across the battlefield, blinding the Persian lines. The Sasanian commander fell. His forces broke. The road to the imperial capital lay open. When Arab armies entered Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, what they found astonished even battle-hardened soldiers. Silks, jewels, gold plate, the accumulated wealth of centuries. The great throne hall, with its famous arched vaults soaring nearly 40 meters overhead, still stood as a monument to everything Persia had built. Its ruins stand today on the outskirts of modern Baghdad, the only surviving piece of ancient Ctesiphon, a solitary arch in the desert, reminding anyone who passes what once existed here. The last Sasanian king retreated eastward for 6 more years, a monarch without a capital, trying to reconstitute an empire dissolving around him. He died in 651 CE, not in battle, but murdered by a local miller for his remaining possessions. The last of the Sasanian line ended not with a final stand, but with a body by a riverbank in the eastern dust. Yet what followed was not the erasure that had consumed so many other civilizations. Iranian administrators, scholars, and court traditions quietly carried forward through the transition. Persian bureaucratic methods, the very systems that had run empires for centuries, began reasserting themselves at the center of the new Islamic world. The caliphs who had conquered Persia found they needed Persian expertise to govern what they had won. The Persian language, spoken in homes and markets across the plateau, refused to disappear. The ancient spring festival of Nowruz, rooted in the Zoroastrian calendar, continued to be celebrated across the Iranian countryside, a rhythm of the year that no foreign conquest had yet managed to interrupt. Persia had been conquered. It was beginning, quietly and with extraordinary patience, to conquer from within. The reconquest from within came most visibly through language, in the courts of regional Persian governors, in the homes of scholars who now wrote in Arabic by day and dreamed in Persian by night. A language was being preserved that would eventually produce some of the greatest literature the medieval world would ever know. By the late 800s, a Persian family called the Samanids had risen to govern the northeastern province of Khorasan in the caliph's name. In practice, they governed for themselves, and they did so in Persian. Their court at Bukhara became a laboratory for the rebirth of Persian as a literary language. They patronized poets who wrote in a refined New Persian, the same language their subjects actually spoke. And from that court emerged a figure whose work would define Iranian identity for 1,000 years. Abu al-Qasim Ferdowsi spent the better part of 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. 60,000 verses, the mythic history of Iran from the dawn of creation to the Arab conquest. A vast tapestry of heroes, doomed kings, and impossible loves. The Persian it was written in was so pure that schoolchildren can still read it today. While Ferdowsi was writing mythology, his contemporaries were transforming the structure of human knowledge. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, had memorized the Quran by age 10 and mastered Greek philosophy and medicine not long after. His canon of medicine remained a standard textbook in European universities until the 1600s. Al-Biruni, born in what is today Uzbekistan, calculated the circumference of the Earth with startling accuracy, wrote pioneering studies of Indian civilization, and produced work in mathematics and astronomy that feels almost modern in its discipline. Persian had become something extraordinary, not merely the language of one people, but the shared literary tongue of an entire civilization stretching from Istanbul to Delhi.
Then came what historians still struggle to fully describe. In 1219 CE, the Mongol armies arrived. They did not simply conquer territories, they erased them. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years vanished in days. Merv, once home to more than 500,000 souls, fell in 1221 CE. Nishapur, where Omar Khayyam had once calculated the movements of stars, was left so completely destroyed that Mongol forces are said to have stacked its ruins with silent precision. Iran's agricultural civilization rested on a network of underground irrigation channels called qanats, some of them centuries old, carrying water from mountain aquifers across desert plains. Mongol armies destroyed these systems. Fields that had fed millions returned to desert. The ecological damage outlasted the violence by generations. Scholars estimate Iran's population may have fallen by 2/3 within decades. It was not merely a political catastrophe, it was a civilizational wound of extraordinary depth. And yet, with the grim rhythm that defines so much of Iranian history, catastrophe again preceded flowering. The Mongol rulers who stayed, and they did stay, found themselves unable to remain untouched by what surrounded them. Within 2 generations, Mongol rulers were converting to Islam, patronizing Persian art, building Persian-style mosques with blue-tiled domes, and funding poets and scholars. The conquerors who had come to erase a civilization found themselves, instead, absorbed by it. Once again, Iran had done what no other civilization in history had managed to do with such consistency. It had turned its destroyers into its students. Out of that long crucible of invasion and absorption, something wholly unexpected emerged. Not a foreign conqueror, not a dynasty carried in on horseback from the steppes, but a movement born from within Iran itself, from the mystical Sufi brotherhoods that had quietly sustained Persian spiritual life through centuries of upheaval. The Safavid order had its origins in the city of Ardabil in northwestern Iran. Founded as a peaceful religious brotherhood, it drew followers through spiritual teaching rather than military ambition. Then gradually, across generations of political instability and trauma, something hardened inside it. In 1501 CE, a 14-year-old boy named Ismail captured the ancient city of Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Iran. Then he made a declaration that would separate his civilization from its neighbors for the next 5 centuries. He proclaimed Twelver Shia Islam the official religion of Iran and enforced the transformation with absolute conviction. In a territory where the majority had been Sunni Muslim for centuries, this was not a gentle invitation. It was a permanent, irreversible choice. The consequences rippled outward immediately. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful Sunni state on earth, recognized an existential rival. The collision at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 CE established a frontier between Sunni and Shia worlds that would define the political map of the Middle East for centuries, a line whose echoes can still be traced in the headlines of today. What Ismail truly created, more than a dynasty or a border, was a distinctly Iranian religious identity. By binding Shia Islam to Iranian civilization, he separated Iran permanently from its Arab and Turkish neighbors and forged a sense of distinctiveness that would survive every subsequent upheaval.
When Shah Abbas first came to power in 1588 CE, he inherited a state under siege from every direction. What he built in response became one of the most beautiful cities the world had ever seen. He moved his capital to Esfahan. Persian architects raised the Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, an immense public space more than 500 meters long, ringed by 2-story arcades anchored by mosques whose tile work shifted between cream and rose depending on the angle of light. Persians simply called Esfahan Nesf-e-Jahan, half the world. The boast was not entirely immodest. Safavid carpets, their geometric and floral patterns achieving a refinement never surpassed before or since, flowed outward to European courts and Ottoman palaces. Persian miniature painting, silk weaving, and metalwork reached peaks of accomplishment that left visiting European diplomats searching for adequate language. What Shah Abbas built endured long after his dynasty was gone. Esfahan's mosques still stand. Its square still draws millions of visitors each year. What he built in stone and tile outlasted every conqueror who followed. And that, in the end, is the central mystery at the heart of this story. 25 centuries of empire, invasion, and reinvention. The Greeks came, the Arabs came, the Mongols came, Tamerlane came. Each time, the expectation was the same, that this civilization would do what every other civilization eventually does, disappear. Each time, the expectation was wrong. The Persian language survived every invasion. The poetry written under foreign occupation became the literary inheritance of an entire world. The architects of a conquered civilization built the palaces of their conquerors. The bureaucrats of a fallen empire ran the administrations of those who had defeated them. Perhaps the deepest truth of Iranian history is this: some civilizations survive by being the strongest, others survive by being the most themselves. And the world is still learning what that means.